seconds and then we will be underway. So just bear with us. Okay, let's make a start. It's 12:02, so let's make a start. Welcome to the launch of Cities Outlook 2022. Cities Outlook is now in its 15th year, and it's the Centre's flagship analysis of urban Britain, as well as providing a comprehensive overview of the economic performance of the UK's 63 biggest cities and towns. Each year we identify an issue to explore in more detail. Previously, we've looked at issues such as Brexit, austerity and automation, and many, many more. This year, the focus is on the ongoing impact of COVID-19 on our urban high streets, what this means for places as they rebuild their economies after the pandemic, and the implications for the government's much anticipated and long delayed levelling up white paper. And we're very fortunate to have a fantastic set of speakers with us today to explore these sorts of issues. So before we get underway, let me just say a few words of housekeeping. As always, the event is being recorded and will be made available on our website after the event. During the event, your microphones will be kept on mute. If you want to tweet about the event, the hashtag is Cities Outlook 2022. You can post your questions to our speakers at any time. You do that by sending a question via the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen, and we will be done no later than 1:30. So let's get underway. Our first speaker is my colleague, Paul Swinney. Paul is the Centre's Director of Policy and Research, and he's going to give us an overview of the Outlook's main findings and implications. Paul, over to you.
Marvellous. Thank you very much, Andrew. Good afternoon, everybody. So Cities Outlook has got three sections to it. It's got a first chapter, which looks at challenges for levelling up. It's got the second chapter, which looks at the performance of high streets. It's got a third online chapter, which has all the data you can ever want to look at the 63 largest urban areas that we study. And please do go and have a play around with the tool. It's excellent. But what I want to do here for 10 minutes is outline what that main chapter, chapter 2, tells us about whether COVID has killed the high street or not over the last 2 years. So let me show you what we have found. So first thing to say is that going into the pandemic, not every high street was struggling. And certainly the narrative that you would get if you were gleaning from the press before the pandemic even hit was that every high street everywhere in the country was dying as a result of online shopping in particular, and perhaps a little bit of business rates too. But the map here shows that actually those places in the greater southeast or large cities elsewhere actually had very low vacancy rates or shop vacancy rates in the centre of their places, whereas in smaller places in the North and Midlands in particular tend to have larger shop vacancy rates, and they were the places that tend to be struggling when we thought about the high street dying. But interestingly, the pandemic has completely turned this on its head. So it's been those places that went into the pandemic in a weaker position that have actually been more sheltered, where it's been those places that went in on quite strong footing that have been hardest hit. And so this is exactly what this chart tries to capture by measuring a concept of weeks of lost sales. So how many sales did high street businesses in the centre of our towns and cities lose as a result of the pandemic? And we can see on the one hand, you've got a place like Burnley, where on average, high street businesses in the centre of Burnley lost just 8 weeks of sales, which is pretty good going, given the average of lockdown was 34 weeks of lockdown for a lot of non-essential retail. But on the other end of the scale, you see the number of our large city centres, and London in particular, coming out bottom of the pile, with on average, high street business in the centre of London losing almost a year's worth of sales since the pandemic hit in March 2020. Now, impact that this has then had in terms of vacancy rates has been very interesting. So the two colours to focus on here is that dark green bar and then that purple bar. The dark green bar is the increase in vacancy rates that we saw in the 2 years before the pandemic, and the purple one is the increase that we've seen since March 2020. Now, what you can see in stronger city centres, and we split our city centres into two groups, stronger and weaker, in terms of where they were going into the pandemic. In stronger city centres, you can see that that purple bar, perhaps unsurprisingly, is much greater than the green bar. So when trading was pretty good, there was an increase in vacancy rates in these places, but actually that is very much accelerated as the pandemic has hit. Perhaps somewhat curiously, in weaker city centres, that purple bar is smaller than the green bar. So what we can see in the 2 years before the pandemic, they were really struggling. You know, there was quite a large increase in the number of vacant units in them on average. But you can see since March 2020, while there's been a continued increase, that increase has actually slowed, which is quite a surprise when you think that a number of the businesses in the centre of these places actually literally could not trade for quite a significant period of time. We haven't seen a linked increase in vacancy rates. And so clearly that is good news in the short term, at the very least, for these places. So the question is, well, why is that? Well, there are three reasons why big centres have struggled, and they're all grouped under the reasoning that what was their strength pre-pandemic has very much become a weakness during COVID. So the first one is that big cities or successful cities had very large catchment areas, were pulling in people from a much larger distance to come in and work or to shop or to spend their leisure time. And clearly COVID restrictions very much constrained that in terms of the advice that was given about how much you should be moving around. The second reason is that a much larger share of spend in stronger centres was on non-essential type activities. So particularly hospitality, bars and restaurants. You can see there in stronger city centres made up about a quarter of spend, whereas in weaker city centres made up about 16% of spend. And what we know is that hospitality in particular had very harsh restrictions put on it in respect of trying to stop the spread of COVID. So particularly big impact here for stronger centres, whereas weaker centres had more spending going on essential items, in which those shops were not closed at all during the pandemic. And then the third reason is that successful city centres, strong city centres, had a much larger number of jobs in the centre of them, office-based jobs that were pulling people in on a daily basis. Now, clearly, again, work from home guidance then meant that all of a sudden this segment of the market that the bars, cafes, restaurants were selling to disappeared overnight. You know, disappeared back into back bedrooms or kitchen tables of houses sort of spread around that city or beyond, as opposed to being concentrated in the centre and those people then going out to spend money at lunchtime after work, or perhaps even, dare we say, maybe even skiving in the afternoon. Now, there's one further element sort of within this which helps explain why vacancy rates in weaker centres perhaps haven't risen as much as maybe what we would expect, and that's down to government support. So there were two types of government support. One's been broadly around tax packages, and that was particularly business rates, and the second one has been around government grants. Now, in terms of that first element of tax cuts, the business rates holidays that the government put in place have very much benefited stronger places. Now, the reason for that is because in weaker places, a lot of their property was already exempt from the business rate system. So basically, they were on a permanent business rates holiday. And the holiday that's being created for a lot of properties in stronger places is create an equalisation between the two areas. So the type of support that weaker places have got for quite some time, stronger areas are then able to benefit from that. The second package, government grants, has very much benefited weaker places over stronger places. So you can see here, on average, weaker places just about tend to get more grants than what stronger places did. But the absolute total is not probably so important. The interesting point is that because in weaker places, rents were lower and other business costs were lower, that grant stretched much further than what it did in stronger places, and therefore provided a much greater amount of support. So what you then had in weaker places is not only did sales fall less than in stronger places, but actually there was a large wedge of government support that came in to prop them up. And the government grant system very much working in the same way that the furlough system has worked within the jobs market to sort of keep potentially shops and bars and restaurants open that might have closed otherwise. The question then is, well, what does all of this mean for the future? You know, are we going to return back to vibrant high streets on the left, or are we going to see a decline of high streets on the right? Well, for bigger places, the bad news clearly is that they've been very much hard hit by the pandemic. But the good news is that they're in a really strong position to bounce back, because the underlying fundamentals are very strong in terms of size of catchment area, amount of money that people have to spend who live within that catchment area, and the bigger question, but the jobs that they've got in their centre too, will those jobs come back? If they do, again, that's a lot of footfall on the street, potentially money to be spent, and it puts them in that stronger position. Whereas in weaker places, they don't have any of those fundamentals to the same extent, or the strength of them is much weaker. And what that then means is, returning back even to 2019 levels is a pretty, is not a place where we really want to be. We're not very happy with that, because they were struggling already because those fundamentals are weak. And I think that the bigger alarm bell from the research that we found is that because of government grants, it might actually be that we haven't as yet felt the full force of the pandemic in some of these weaker city centres. And it might well be that we've stored up the pain, and we will actually see an increase in vacancy rates throughout this year as hopefully the economy begins to open up. Now, the challenge then from a policy perspective is that in stronger places, it's about getting people back. The fundamentals are there, but how do you get people back in? Encouraging people to go back from a work perspective, encouraging people to go back from a leisure perspective, and just focus on that short-term nature of getting those people back. But for weaker places, the challenge is not short-term, it's long-term, and it's linked to the performance of their economy. And what the Levelling Up white paper needs to do in particular, if it does want to see more vibrant high streets, is focusing on trying to get not only more jobs into places, but better paid jobs into places to put more money in people's pockets to then go and spend. Now, that's a strong, long, fundamental challenge that we face there, which means that cosmetic style policies around, say, painting shop fronts or hanging baskets are not going to cut it unless we do the long-term stuff too. And that's where focus on policy needs to be for those places. Back to you, Andrew.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Great overview, 10 minutes on loads and loads of detail, all of which obviously you can get on our website in various forms to really dive into the detail. And I think in sense that, the impact of the pandemic seems to be more complicated and less straightforward than is often portrayed and discussed. I think that's an important point to make, because then it has a series of implications for the future. And the second thing I think is, there is a lot of uncertainty still about the future. We don't exactly know, no one exactly knows how some of these patterns of behavior change will play out, how much to the extent they'll be sticky and how big they'll be. And so we're having to make some decisions about the future of our places, given that uncertainty. And I think that's just an extra challenge for policymakers at the local and national level. But anyway, let's move to our first panel and hear from three different places about what they've heard, but also what they're doing. So our first set of panelists, let me introduce them. First is Caroline Green. She's the Chief Executive of Oxford City Council. Second panelist is Tony Reeves, Chief Executive of Liverpool City Council. And my third panelist is Tom Raden, who's Chief Executive of Leeds City Council. And full disclosure, Tom is also a board member of the Centre for Cities. So that's our first panel. Each of them is going to take a few minutes to set out their stall in terms of the reflections on the findings, but also what they're then doing to help their cities recover. And I'm going to come to you first, Caroline. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Hello, everybody, and thanks to Centre for Cities for inviting me to give a perspective from Oxford today. And as ever, I think Centre for Cities report provides a real interesting insight to some of the myths, the misunderstandings, and the detail behind the headlines. The report does confirm, in terms of its commentary on places like Oxford, it does confirm much of what we're seeing locally. Oxford's one of those places that had a stronger high street pre-pandemic and was hit very, very hard for the reason that Paul spelt out. And it's, as you would expect, of a city that is reliant on international tourists, students, and office workers. And I think Oxford ranks highest in terms of numbers of jobs that can be done from home. So it's a sort of triple whammy there. So it isn't really a surprise that the report finds that we rank very highly in terms of lost sales at 41 weeks, and that we were worst affected in terms of the increase in store vacancies at 8%. And just to complement that, some research that's been done locally recently on the visitor economy also shows that there's a 66% decline in visitor spend in Oxford and a 51% reduction in jobs in that sector. And that represents a potential loss of about £665 million to the local economy. So really, really significant issue. But as the report also says, what we're now seeing really is, I think, an acceleration and continuation of a trend that actually started before the pandemic, and that's a reinvention of the high street, and particularly a move away from reliance on some of the more traditional retail. So the report finds that Oxford had a 20% vacancy. Local intelligence suggests it's actually now about 13%. And if you take out units that are being refurbished or are under offer, actually it's more like a 5% vacancy rate. And that reflects really the underlying strength of demand for commercial space in the city. And so we're seeing that the city is already adapting to changes in demand in food and drink, independent retail, and a really strong underpinning demand in Oxford for office and lab space. And actually it's been a problem for many years in terms of the constraint. But we have seen 30 new businesses set up in the city centre last year, 60% of them independent. So it's a definite reinvention. The steep drop-off in spend was then followed by a strong bounce back, and in November of last year we were about 94% of footfall in the same month in pre-pandemic times. And it's interesting that happened without the return of tourism. So the bounce back has been driven by a greater number of local people using the city. So challenges going forward, sustaining that recovery means we've got to keep local people using the city. We've got to support tourism, and we've got to support that diversification and ensure that overwhelming demand for office and lab space doesn't crowd out the other more vulnerable sectors of retail, hospitality and creative industries. But for Oxford, we need to do that that depends on us addressing some really critical systemic underlying issues. Firstly, we've got to maximise the opportunity in a constrained city with not much space to find and make best use of that available commercial space, competing as we are in terms of need for more space for affordable housing, which is another main constraint for the city. But secondly, and really importantly, it's about addressing inequality. So Oxford is the second most unequal city in the country. And that's relevant to what you're talking about in terms of consumer demand and ensuring that more local people using the city, coming in to use the city, depends on their ability to access jobs and addressing some of our issues in terms of our most deprived areas, some of which are in the 20% most deprived areas of the country. And then perhaps the biggest one I want to highlight is around transport. So the bounce back we saw in footfall wasn't matched by a bounce back in public transport. Whilst the car is back to pre-pandemic uses, buses are about 64%. And for a city that prided itself on high levels of public transport use before the pandemic, it's a real issue, and it really threatens to worsen congestion and air quality. So addressing those transport challenges, always been an issue for Oxford, are even more essential now. I know I'm taking up too much time, so I won't keep it short, but some of the things we've done during the pandemic that lots of other places have done around pavement licenses, improving outdoor spaces and so on, we need to continue doing that. Some of those that were brought in as emergency measures, the short timeframes hampered proper engagement and consultation and some of the more strategic scheme design. Nevertheless, overall positive, but continuing to build on those is actually picking up on one of the recommendations of your report, really does need that coherent and longer term strategy. So we are consulting on a new economic strategy for the city, which is about how we get to drive a more inclusive, globally competitive and greener recovery. And alongside that, a city centre vision, which is about providing the longer term strategy. We've got some really ambitious plans for how we can tackle those transport congestion issues, but it does require that long-term strategy and long-term investment. So I'll finish just by saying I think the two key recommendations of the report around skills and education opportunity areas and around that need for a longer term strategy and investment pot chime really well for Oxford as well as for other areas in the city, because some of our future success of our high street do require us to level up locally within our own region and take that longer term view to some of our more systemic challenges.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. Covered loads of ground there. I really appreciate it. And particularly, I think, interesting about the reinvention question that you talked about, how that happens and how then you manage the kind of short-term impacts that may have, come through COVID, but actually how do they interact with some of the longer term pressures and plans and aspirations and things that need to happen outside of COVID, and whether they make it more easier in some respects or more difficult, but we'll come back to that. Tony, let's come to you. Let's get a view on Liverpool and how the high street and the sort of town centre, city centre is fared, and then what you're doing to help the place recover. Tony.
Thanks very much, and it's really good to be here with you. I think for us, it really is, depending on which lens you look at, you get a very different picture. So from a retailing point of view, Liverpool has rebounded really, really well. Our main shopping centre, the Liverpool One shopping centre, which for the 5 years up to 2019, bucked the national trend with year-on-year growth in footfall and retail spend, has done very, very well as we've opened up from summer last year. So footfall is a bit down on 2019, which was a record year, as you'd expect, but retail spend is quite a bit ahead of 2019. Now, obviously, some of that will be people will have saved money during lockdown and then going on spending sprees. Of course, it's a concern with the cost of living going up rapidly and what impact that is going to have in subduing retail spend, particularly discretionary spend going forwards. But the retail rebound in the city centre has been very strong. And whilst I absolutely accept the trends the report sets out, that a lot more retailing is online, etc., I think what this demonstrates, and you can see the same in other really successful retailing centres, is if the experience is right, then the high street still has a lot to offer. It's the poorer, older district centres that are really struggling and being squeezed. Thankfully, the centre of Liverpool isn't one of those. If you look through the hospitality lens, where obviously visitor numbers have been down significantly, the hospitality sector has been hit very hard over the pandemic. It's worth about £4 billion in a normal year to us in economic output. That has been significantly down over this period. But it's been boosted, the loss of international visitors, where we get 35 million visitors a year to the city normally. The loss of international visitors have been boosted by a lot of UK visitors, and bizarrely, the cruise industry, which is of growing significance for us, has adapted really quickly. And we had lots of round Britain cruises, and literally a cruise ship in every day during the cruise season, unloading passengers right into the city centre on a daily basis. We also, as we opened up, we were able to put on really good cultural events, and Liverpool has a great track record of doing that, of course, and that really helped to support the economy as well. I think the other things I'd touch on in terms of the actions that we took, we were the city that piloted mass testing, and that made a significant difference to. I'm sorry, we were the first to enter Tier 3. That made a significant difference to how quickly we could open up. And of course, for hospitality, the Christmas period is absolutely key in terms of trading. In Liverpool's case, and I think it's the same in other major cities, about 30% of annual profit is made during December. In December 2020, we were the only major city that was open for Christmas. And unfortunately, the world came to Liverpool and brought all their germs with us. So we saw a huge spike in COVID rates in January 2021. December 21 was a different story because the fear of Omicron and rising infection rates, even though we weren't in lockdown, significantly affected demand. There were lots of cancellations, and lots of hospitality businesses told me they were 20 to 25% down on their normal bookings, and that really eats into profit margins. We also, when the social distancing measures came in with 2 meter social distancing, we introduced a concept called Liverpool Without Walls, where we closed streets to traffic and opened up hospitality onto the street with well-designed covers and weather protection for people, so that the businesses could get more covers because their fixed costs were the same and their revenue was significantly challenged by otherwise losing numbers of patrons. That worked really well, and on the back of our mass testing, we were asked by government to pilot a whole series of events, from nightclubs, gigs, raves, business conferences, etc. And I think all of that really helped to build confidence in the city. And what that has meant is that footfall in Liverpool, whilst it has been challenged, is significantly ahead of other cities in terms of how quickly it's rebound. We're about 85 to 90% of the footfall we had pre-pandemic. Public transport patronage is 10 percentage points ahead of the average for British cities at the moment, according to the operators. And that has made a difference. I think the key going forwards for us is to not go back to where we were. It's to take some of the lessons from COVID. The concept of Liverpool Without Walls, we want to build on that. We're likely to close some more roads in the city centre to build that sort of cafe style culture, particularly in the summer months, and enhancing Liverpool's offer for tourists and visitors, etc. We're really clear in terms of our economic strategy. We're focusing on high growth sectors, particularly health and life sciences, material science, digitech. Health and life sciences is a really key strength for us, and particularly the Liverpool-Manchester axis, which the two cities are talking to each other about, starting to build collaborative approaches. You take that collectively, and there's some world-leading strengths with some real growth potential for the future. Net zero is obviously hugely important to us in making sure we're adapting really smartly and quickly. And as I always say, it's the cities that need to innovate. If you leave it to national government, we'll be struggling. But cities have that knowledge base, that connections between people and businesses and other things that can allow them to adapt really quickly to new environments. And history tells us that that's the case. And I think it's a key challenge for our cities to really lead the move to net zero. And Liverpool certainly will be doing its bit with that, including things like harnessing tidal power, etc. And I think the third thing is around inclusion and making sure that as we adapt our economy, that inclusion is absolutely at the heart of that. And that means for me, in terms of levelling up, it can't just be about high profile projects. It has to be a combination of really good targeted long-term investment coupled with radical public sector reform that is capable of tackling the inequalities that have held northern cities back for a long time. And Tom and I are part of the Core Cities group, of course, and we commissioned OECD a couple of years ago to do some analysis on the reasons why productivity in core cities in the UK lag behind the national average, where in France, Germany, North America, the core cities, as you would expect, outperform the national average.
Yes.
And you find that deprivation inequality accounts for almost half of the reason why that productivity gap is down. So really good public sector reform, systemically addressing the issues that have held our cities back for far too long, coupled with good long-term investment in the right areas, is what's going to be required to take us forward. And I think the final bit for us is rebuilding that brand for international visitors in the post-COVID period. We've got a huge events program for the second half of this year, and we're very confident we can do that as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Tony. Again, covering loads of ground, but talking a little bit about, again, highlighting how to lock in some of the good things that have happened through the pandemic, not lose them as we then, hopefully as we emerge. I think is a kind of ongoing point. And your distinction between, and we see this in the numbers, between cities recovering on the weekend, as it were, from a consumption point of view, and how that sometimes differs with how they recover during the week as a place of production or kind of place of office work. And I think those two things, they interrelate, but they are slightly different, present different challenges. Anyway, let's move to Leeds and hear what Tom's got to say. Tom, good to see you. Thanks for joining us, and tell us what's going on in Leeds.
Thanks, Andrew, and great to see everybody. But I won't. I'm conscious of your time, so I won't dwell on the particular situation here. In terms, it's very similar to what's been described by Caroline and Tony, and I very much recognise Paul's analysis about the impact on the, being hit hard, very hard during the pandemic, but probably been in a good place to bounce back, and maybe the smaller towns and cities being maybe the reverse of that. And I think that's something that I'll come on to, but I'll maybe focus on what we're doing and what I think is needed, both from ourselves and from government. I think that the need for clear, ambitious, distinctive plans for your place are more than ever important, more than ever, particularly because of the challenges of workforce that are going to be with us for this decade. Channel 4, UK Investment Bank, Bank of England, Burberry Sky, all came to Leeds for a reason, and it wasn't, those reasons haven't changed. They really liked our vision for the city, more of a sort of Northern European vision, I would say, better use of public space, cycling, walking, less dense development, and access to a really good quality of life on your doorstep with the countryside and green space. The investment pipeline for us is still very strong. I was walking around the south bank of our city on Friday, and there's a huge number of cranes. There's investment going in, but I think particularly planning the retail core and your retail offer is so important, and getting that right. We've got similar levels of voids to what was in the report, but we've had we've held the line in the last few years that we haven't allowed major out of town. We've tried to replace more tired, retail development with much brighter and more engaging and attractive retail development, and that's worked. The footfall numbers are really interesting. People are coming. There's more people coming at the weekend now than pre-pandemic, but probably overall taking the whole week, fewer trips, but people are spending more when they come. So it's less just I'm going to go in for the sake of it, and more I'm going to go in for a reason. And the link between digital and online and the retail itself is going to be really, really important as well. And I think that green agenda that Tony mentioned, we've got a massive district heating system going into Leeds. We've got a large electric vehicle fleet. We've got our buses and taxis are getting much greener due to the work that we've done with getting grants to them. That is, that's important as well. So that overall ambition and distinctive plan, I think, is really important. I think return to office is the biggest unknown, and whoever claims that they know the answer to that, I suspect they're guessing. I think the workforce issue and the challenge of hanging on to good staff and also recruiting new staff is is affecting everybody now. And I think if you move too fast and too dramatically on return to the office, you may find people worried about the risk that will have on losing their workforce. And with the cost of living issues looming really large this year as well, for the lower paid members of staff, if they can do as productive a job from not having to come in every day of the week, then I think that will sustain in employers generally. I think what won't sustain and is more likely to be required is that the higher paid members do need to come in more and do need to make sure they're getting the benefit of collaboration. But that will vary by sector. So, the impact on the tech sector has been very interesting in our city. And in a way, your labour market, expands potentially if you don't have to have people coming into the office all the time. So it's a very interesting time. And I think it's very hard to call, but most of us are feeling that it will settle with, we're not going back to what we were doing before. Everybody commuting in at the same time, twice a day, cramming themselves onto public transport and cramming themselves going home, but probably a slightly more nuanced working pattern, more of a balance. But the coming into work in cities is by no means dead, and I think that is going to return, but probably not on the scale that it was before. And then thinking about different patterns of work and leisure, Thursday night's the new Friday in some of our cities. And, that's important for bearing in mind the impact on the hospitality sector. I think we're all going to need to work harder and are working harder to give people a reason for being in our places. We did a big dinosaur initiative that was hugely successful last summer. Big initiatives around Christmas, Eat Leeds. We've got a big cultural festival in 2023 that we're working towards. Having a successful Premiership Football Club at last in Leeds has been quite important for us as well. So I think just thinking about how you can make your place more attractive for people to come and visit, as Tony said, in terms of tourism in particular, is really important. I think acting quickly on voids where you get the Debenhams impact or BHS and others, making sure that you've got other uses, particularly in those places where those big retailers have been the anchors, I think is going to be critical. And you won't find, like for like going in there. And I know that's happening already, but the more fleet of foot you can be, the more impact that can have. We've done a piece of work about our district centres. We're a widely drawn boundary. So we have places like Wetherby and Morley and Kippax and Kirkstall, Pudsey, that are, smaller district centres in their own right. So we've been actively thinking about that, done some studies. And I think it's interesting that although they haven't lost as much from the people working from home, they probably haven't gained as much as well. So it isn't always the case that if someone is working from home, they'll nip out and, go for a sandwich in their local where they live. And I think there might need to be some thought around that. So we're doing some thinking around that, around co-location and shared spaces to make it a bit easier for people to drop in and meet in those district centres as well. And I think that will be important. Just finishing off, the government, I think, needs to take a much more radical look at how they are empowering towns and cities to be able to shape their own destiny, do what's needed. It won't be fixed through capital pots of money with competitions. It is much more about, if you want local cultural and public amenities to come back and for high streets to thrive, then people need to be spending money in them. You need to have some base revenue funding supporting councils and supporting local cultural amenities to stay open, to be able to attract people in the first place. So I'd like to see much more about revenue spend coming from government and that empowerment. I'd like to see much more about bus regulation, being the mayors like you're going to hear from Andy, but Tracy and Al Patch and others having much more control over buses. Really important in terms of that next phase of linking us all up together better. And the shared prosperity funding, the repatriated European funding, has got to be devolved down to local areas, or, you know, we won't be taking back control. It will be actually the Treasury taking even more control, not just 95% of decisions that affect us in local areas, but probably 96 or 97%. And that's got to be reversed. That's got to be put right. So I'll leave it there, Andrew.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. Tom, completely agree with your comments on who's in the driving seat. We've got a couple of minutes, only got a couple of minutes, and obviously there's just loads of stuff that we could cover. I suppose I want to sort of pick up on maybe the point that some of you or all of you have made in different ways is, you know, the challenges and opportunities of taking a city centre wide approach to, you know, thinking about our places post-pandemic, rather than just letting things happen and, you know, and things will maybe recover because you're all in kind of fairly strongish areas. Things will come back, but it's not just them coming back, it's coming back in a way that they are ideal, you know, when you bring them together. Tony, let me start with you. Just give me a couple of thoughts on that, the sort of city centre wide approach and why that's important and what you're doing. And then I get Caroline and Tom to come in as well. Tony.
Yeah, I agree with Tom. I think the office market will come back strongly. I don't think the nature of work will be exactly as it was before the pandemic. I think this has accelerated agile working, but work as a place rather than just an activity still has a future. I think the demand is going to be for more modern office stock, and that's going to challenge the older office areas and going to require real repurposing of parts of our city centres, together with some aspects of poorer quality retailing, not necessarily low value, but poorer quality in terms of experience, means that we'll have an ongoing task over the coming years to repurpose and not just see investment going to some places and disinvestment from others.
Yeah.
And actually, some of the levelling up funding being targeted over the long term to create systemic change in our cities could enable some of that to happen. And I think that's absolutely critical. I think the other thing Tom's mentioned there, the bus services, for me, the mode of transport that is most important in terms of economic inclusion, our buses and our bus services outside the capital have simply not been good enough in this country, enabled for the last couple of decades, and getting that right to really drive inclusion is hugely important as well. There's
Excellent.
A whole host of other things, but I'll leave it to
I appreciate that. That's really helpful. Caroline, pick up this there, because we've had loads of questions now about, you know, defining and shaping the future, not just letting the future sort of shape and emerge through a series of maybe uncoordinated set of questions. Oxford, as you said, demand is going to be strong, still is strong. So there's not a question about that. It's about how do you manage that for the greater good. I mean, what's your kind of perspective? What's your approach for dealing with that in Oxford?
Yeah, I mean, just pick up on something I think it was Tom said earlier about the importance of having a clear and distinctive plan for place. You know, and that's absolutely the case for Oxford as much as it is for Leeds or Liverpool or elsewhere. Because in a place where you have got sort of strong underpinning demand, and because of a constrained environment, it is, you know, quite possible that simply you just go with whatever the strongest market trend is. So, you know, really having that strategy and sense of identity, and for Oxford, it won't surprise you off the back of the vaccine developed through the pandemic. It's really strengthened Oxford's reputation and global brand around health and life sciences, as well as its, you know, famous historic landscape. But, you know, unless we have a connected plan that actually recognises, promotes those assets and those draws, but actually puts in place or fixes the bits of the system needed to fulfil it, then we will just see increasing pressures and increasing inequality in the city. So a couple of things I wanted to pick up on was, again, around transport.
Yeah.
I touched on buses earlier. I completely agree with what's been said about their importance in terms of inclusion. But in Oxford at the moment, travel times are, it can be about 10 minutes a mile because congestion is so bad.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we're seeing people more afraid to use buses because of infection. And so bus service decline is actually declining from those areas, more deprived areas on the outskirts of the city, that have, that have less ability to anywhere. So in terms of the kind of strategic approach to transport, we can't just look at buses on their own. We've got a zero emission zone starting in the city centre this year, but bigger plans to work on something we call Connected Oxford, which is about bus gates, investment and improvement in buses and walking and cycling, and a real transformation of the kind of transport networks in the city, connected into big rail improvements of the station and a new branch line.
Right.
So, I think that is absolutely connected to another point, which is it's about that district centres. So Oxford city centre is strong, but we also have district centres which equally suffer some of the characteristics outlined in the report of less successful areas. And so one of the things we're looking at is the idea of a 15-minute economy. And how can you make sure that local areas have got facilities and services and that they can access without that reliance on having to travel a long way from where they live.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Tom, time is against us, but just your thought on, that sort of city centre wide approach and the value of it, rather than just let stuff happen and then, you have to deal with the consequences in some respects.
Yeah, I think we've just got to be more, we were collaborative before, we've got to get even better at it. And so working with our universities as cities, for example, is a massively important issue linked to the points being made about our assets in terms of sectors, the work that we do to support the vulnerable within our cities and make sure that we don't try and gentrify them, but we support those local efforts to deal with rough sleeping and homelessness is really, really important and needed more than ever. And I'll finish we've got an open spaces strategy for our city centre. The use of public space, the spaces between buildings, all of us have known over the years, that's the bit that sometimes is the most attractive bit for people to come and see. We've got Samuel L. Jackson in Leeds at the moment, filming a Marvel film just because of that, I would say. So I'll finish it there, Andrew, on a topical.
Yeah, that's a drop mic
issue.
moment, Tom. Like, thanks very much. I'm off.
There you go.
Have a bit of lunch with. We can't possibly compete with Samuel Jackson and Marvel. It's a great way to finish. Look, we need to move on, but let me thank Caroline, Tony, and Tom. Thank you very much. Time is always tight, but really appreciate you coming and spending a few minutes with us, giving us great thoughts on what your great cities are up to. So we've heard from our chief executives. Now let's hear from our politicians. So panel 2, let me slightly broaden it out, although colleagues picked up on some of these issues, and connect our city centres and what's going on in them to broader levelling up agenda. My panel this time is Councillor Abby Brown, leader of Stoke City Council, Andy Burnham, Mayor of Greater Manchester, and my third panelist is Jules Pipe, who's the Deputy Mayor of London, with a particular focus on regeneration and skills. Welcome to you all. Abby, if I can turn to you first, you've been super busy sort of repositioning, Stoke as a great place to live, a great place to work, a great place to invest. What are the kind of core elements of that strategy for you, and how does that sort of interact with what's been happening through the pandemic?
Well, thanks very much, Andrew. I think for us, it's tying in really to the plan that actually, I think at this event last year, I talked about, our Stoke-on-Trent prospectus, where I highlighted the 4 things that we would be concentrating on, because they were the 4 things that we felt the government needed to really work with us. In fact, partners need to work with us to bring forward. So that's around transport, regeneration, education skills, and health and productivity. And, I can clearly talk about those on a wider basis, but I think, sort of linked in to the wider status in the city, things like health and productivity, and we are a polycentric city. So I need to get that in. More difficult for us because actually we have a city centre, but we actually have 5 strong or varying degrees of strong local centres around that. And I think, we've worked hard around how we can tie those 4 key elements, in particular around the high street. So, health and productivity, community lounge is something we're trialling in one of our towns. Transport, I probably don't need to say anything else beyond buses. Everybody else has said buses, yes, buses, please.
Always mention buses, Abby, you know that. You get a gold star when you mention buses.
Yeah, and regeneration, clearly, where I think I probably won at the end of last year with my £56 million from Levelling Up Fund bid. But the reality is, as I think has already been said, cash is great, but actually there's never enough cash, even when you put cash in yourself as a local authority, and actually having a plan really helps. But, it is sometimes about moral support too, and partnership.
Very good. All right, thank you. So I'll come back to you on some of the detail of that. Welcome, Andy. Let me turn to you. Good to see you, Andy. And just again, your kind of thoughts on, I suppose how, the pandemic, and as Greater Manchester kind of comes out of the pandemic, we hope, how that recovery has been affected by the pandemic, and what you want to do. You've set out some very ambitious goals for the for the city region. How have those been affected by the pandemic experience?
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everybody, and good to follow Abby. I think we're very we'll see it very similarly, if you like, in terms of we've certainly obviously taken a hit, like everywhere has, and your research today shows. But there's optimism here for where we go in the next phase. I think the research you've done today, Andrew, does kind of ring true for us, which is that the local centres have probably fared better than the regional centre, the city centre. And obviously got Jules on. I think London probably the bigger you are, the harder you fall, I guess, in this instance. And we've certainly felt that in Manchester city centre. However, more positively, it hasn't half bounced back quickly, and it did do in 2021. There was no shortage of footfall, if you like, in the city. So anyone kind of proclaiming the demise of cities, I think, is doing so very, very prematurely. Working from home is not all it's cracked up to be, is it? I don't know if I'm the only one in that that camp. I can confirm my diary is changing back to the city as soon as the minute the guidance was announced. So I'm keen to get back, and I think cities will recover quite quickly, but there is an ongoing sort of mark has been left there. Certainly in terms of transport, just to pick up what Abby was saying, I mean the numbers on public transport, I think, are going to be affected for a period beyond the pandemic, if you like. The kind of tram passenger numbers are about 70% of what they were. Now, that was even during the good times last year, if you like, when we were getting as close back to normal service. So I think there is going to be a sort of hangover there for public transport systems. And I think the government has got to both help us with that, and it's got to help London with that. Let me be really clear about that, because this is affecting all of us. But I think then recognising the critical importance of transport as we build the recovery. From our point of view, I just would want to back up the point about buses, and it's a bit worrying to see the reports now about the bus back better funding being reined in. We have a compelling plan. You'll have heard me talk about it, Andrew, for a London-style public transport system in Greater Manchester. Now is the time to build it. Absolutely, now is the time to build it. Because the thing I was keen to impress upon Michael Gove when he came here a week or so ago, and I think he gets this in a way perhaps some of those around government haven't, is that it can't be towns or cities. It's got to be the two together, and it's got to be transport that then makes the functional economy kind of happen and come together. So what's the evidence of that? I think because of the success of Manchester city centre over the last couple of decades, obviously it's become fairly expensive to live in Manchester city centre. So our town centres now are beginning to sort of, for the first time, I think, really feel the benefit of being close to a successful city. So Stockport has the first mayoral development corporation in the country focused on a town, chaired by Lord Kerslake, Bob Kerslake. And what is emerging in Stockport is a really impressive vision. It's like a mini version of Manchester, if you like. The leader of Stockport Council is fond of saying that Stockport is becoming Brooklyn to Manchester's Manhattan. The point being that, yeah, well, you're laughing.
I admire ambition, Andy. I admire it.
There's plenty of ambition in that statement, isn't there?
No, quite, indeed.
Yeah. But there's something in it as well, of course, in that, Stockport is 10 minutes away from Manchester. And I think there's a reason why there is already a pipeline of 3,500 homes being built in Stockport town centre around a remodeled transport interchange with a lovely green space at the heart of it, just under the famous railway arches. It's going to be city centre living, very close to the city, but perhaps more affordable for people. Go north and look at Rochdale. Again, there's big changes happening in Rochdale town centre, and I think it is linked to the transport connectivity, Andrew. The cities and towns will thrive together when the transport is good, because then the 20, 30 somethings can live there if it's, if they're into the city in 20 or 30 minutes. So that change, we would say, is starting to happen. The pandemic has probably interrupted progress, but it's not thrown it completely off course. It's there, and the Levelling Up white paper really, and I hope, I did say when he came into the job that Michael Gove was the man to define levelling up and put energy behind it. I hope the government gets behind him, and I hope this white paper kind of, really puts some energy into this now, because we're ready to go, and we need to start leading the recovery now from this terrible time that we've been living in. We can't keep firing on one cylinder called London and the Southeast. We have to start firing up other cylinders around the country. We have to free places up to really, really go at it now and do more for themselves. For us, the vision is very much around a drive to a net zero economy. 2038 is our era is defined, if you like. The post-pandemic era is already defined, because it's going to have to be a challenging journey to net zero by 2038. And it is challenging. I'm dealing with a clean air zone debate at the moment, which is maybe can come back to in question if you want to. But my point is, if you go early on this, because cities will have to be the early adopters of net zero, I think that builds the new prosperity. It brings in the jobs, but it can also improve the standard of living for people. It can lower the cost of public transport. It can improve people's homes through retrofitting. That, I think, is the era that we're in, and the change will be built bottom up rather than done top down. And I think the white paper needs to really seize that moment and, cut through some of this equivocation around devolution that we've had in central government. If you're going to do it, this is the time to do it. Free places up to go for it, because, we're seeing no lack of inward investment or interest. I heard Nigel from Legal in General on the radio this morning saying, because we've underinvested in English regional cities, the outside world sees an opportunity. In England's cities outside of London are underpunching their weight at the moment, but they're replete with opportunity to invest. In the net, particularly in the net. We can make a quick leap towards net zero because we haven't had that other investment before. And I just think this is a moment to grab, Andrew, and I'll probably leave it there. Right. So it's actually it's been a tough time for us as much as it has for anybody, but I'm not in any way downcast. I can see a clear path from where we go from here, and we just need to be backed. We need to be backed to build the transport we need, and we need to be backed to build the modern industry that I'm talking about. And one last point. The HS2 bill's been dropped into Parliament today. And again, I would say that's another example of them not backing us enough. They're bringing HS2 to Manchester, which is a good thing, but we're still getting the cut price solution. And I think this is a moment to invest. It's to invest for ambition for the England's regions. And we'll be fighting that case in Parliament over the coming weeks.
Great, thanks, Andy. And I'll come back to Abby as well, get some thoughts on her confidence, optimism on the Levelling Up white paper, which is due any day now. Don't keep counting though, because you'll lose track. Jules, let's turn to you and get your thoughts. I mean, all the numbers tell us London's been hard hit. In a sense, strengths have become weaknesses during the pandemic, even if they are kind of strengths over the longer term. I mean, where are you now in terms of what you're doing to try and help London recover and come out of the pandemic period? You're on mute. Jules, you're on mute. Thank you. I promise one day we'll do this face to face, and I'll never have to say that again. That's my promise to myself in a post-pandemic period.
After all this time, we're still doing things like that. But it's great to join you this morning. It's really clear in the report that where the impact has, really been greatest in London is on the centre. It's been severe, very far-reaching. London's central activity zone. It's faced a bigger challenge than many other places, and I'm not just talking in the UK, I mean globally. And that's all down to the much lower numbers of people living in the centre and our greater reliance, or the centre's greater reliance on commuters and visitors. And of those, it's actually the tourists that is our biggest issue in central London. We reckon last year the loss of consumer spending from commuters was about 2 billion, but the loss from tourism was about 11-12 billion. So that's our big problem going forward. And that's why the Mayor invested a lot of money in the Let's Do London campaign. It's the capital's biggest ever domestic tourism campaign. And we think that's created about a £70 million boost to the economy. But, it's a drop in the ocean compared to where we've got to get back to, certainly with international tourism, because that's the lion's share of that 11 or so billion pounds that we've lost in tourism. People were beginning to come back as a result of that campaign, generating that 70 million of activity. The run up to Christmas before Omicron struck. Weekend visitors are up to about 94-95% of pre-pandemic levels, which was good. Not so good in the evenings of weekdays, nearer 78%. 78-80%. And of course, those numbers plunged right back down again in this latest wave. But like all your other panelists today, we're confident that they're going to pick up going forward, particularly with the recent change of rules, particularly on the domestic market. But international tourism, it remains a big concern. London air travel tourism numbers obviously were a long way from pre-pandemic levels, and we don't think they're going to recover until about 2026 back to their pre-pandemic levels. Regaining our success as a tourist destination. Of course, it's not just vital for the capital, but to the whole UK economy. Many people use London as a jumping off point to see all the great stuff around the rest of the country. So we're all in it together, I think, as cities and towns around places of all sorts around the country about needing those international tourists back. Outside of the central activity zone, traditional visitor hubs, they've also taken a hit. Places like Camden, struggling to see a recovery in spending after the lockdowns. Similarly, the newer retail hubs as well. Westfield at Stratford. I think because they're probably reliant on the big chains, they've also struggled. But overall, our data matches yours. It suggests that in London, it's the local centres that serve their local communities that overall have proved the most resilient. And particularly if they've got a diverse food offer, that's the real notable thing. I think they've particularly, they've fared pretty well, and some even seeing an increase in use as a result. And there's a real persistent ring around the kind of zone 2, zone 3 areas out around the edge of the central activity zone, where daytime residence numbers are really high still, and people are actively using their local high street. And so in some ways that's absolutely to be welcomed. But high streets were always a concern for us even before the pandemic. We absolutely recognise at City Hall that there need to be a pivot in what the offer was, the threat of online shopping. It's really interesting, your report, what you're noting about sort of the plateauing of what we saw in during the pandemic, but it was rising nevertheless, even without the pandemic. And the need to do something else other than expect people to come in, do shopping, leave shops carrying something under their arms. And the offer has got to be more experiential and enjoyable for people. So really, we do need to reimagine our cities in what they offer. Also, that we surely we all share our ambition, the ambition about making all our places, fairer, greener, healthier, as well as more resilient than they were before. And that's certainly the ambition of the London Recovery Board that the Mayor set up in cooperation with sort of public, private, voluntary, community, faith sectors. And the Mayor chairs that, and it's got a series of missions, but one of them is High Streets for All, and it really focuses on bringing back vacant and underused buildings in the high street and public spaces into better use and more productive use. And we want to see sort of fresh ideas to meet long-standing challenges. So we set up this challenge fund, which is funding all the boroughs in London. Every single borough in London has got an opportunity to plan something new for their locality. We've also established a high street data service as well, and a partnership. And it's incredibly useful, the data that's bringing together on spend and footfall. Nighttime enterprise zones, creative enterprise zones, working with the property sector, trialling England's first 2 community improvement districts. So we've got a whole range of activity, going on so we can kind of bounce back from this.
Okay, great, thank you. That's very helpful getting it right. Abby, come back to you and pick up some of these issues, but particularly, it'd be good to get your view on what Stoke is doing. And as you say, you kind of laid out in your prospectus brilliantly what it is that you want to achieve in the city. What do you need then from government in order to do that? You can do some of those things yourselves, and you are obviously doing a lot, but you also need a supportive partner in government and somebody who's going to work with you. I mean, just what is it that you particularly need from them?
Well, I think, as you say, we've laid out in our prospectus where the areas are that we think we need that additional support. And as I say, it's not necessarily always cash. Sometimes it is moral support. And, I think reflecting back on where we've got to 12 months after coming forward with our plan, maybe 2 stores out of 3, I don't know, 6 out of 10. Some areas it's really easy to engage with the government over, and I might not get the answer that I want, but I can have a conversation. So, clearly in terms of regeneration, where, as I say, I've done reasonably well, but I think, equally the challenge, particularly being a polycentric city, is that you're fighting on multiple fronts. So, this morning, we've lost potentially a landmark building within the city. We had a big fire at the weekend at the Leopard, which was where Josiah Wedgwood met James Brindley to talk about canals. Big fire there at the weekend. It's privately owned building, and the future does not look good for that site. And people are saying to me, well, what are you going to do about it? But the reality is that the scale of the heritage within the city is huge. And also then there is that debate around what is the role of the public sector within that. We own lots and lots of heritage buildings already. Is it the right thing for us to do to take another one on when actually there is not enough cash to go around, frankly? And actually, we are seeing some great people coming to the city. I've got to say thank you to Andy, because I'm starting to get developers who are coming from Manchester into Stoke and saying Stoke is like Manchester 30 years ago. So come on down, it's great here, and see what the potential is. And that's really good, actually, to see that happen. And I want to see more of that happening here. But then in other sectors, I'm sure we'll all labour this point, buses, really difficult to get a conversation going about that. Is that because actually so many of us need improved intracity transport? Or is that actually because maybe for me as a medium-sized city, it's more difficult to get the traction of the conversation? But actually, I believe that an increase both in the number of buses I've got and also a different system, it's really expensive to catch a bus in Stoke. And actually, we have a relatively low percentage of car ownership as well in the city. So it's really, really crucial. And we do think it would make a massive difference. Education and skills, actually fairly positive. I've been pretty lucky. 2 successive Secretaries of State endorsed our plans around this, and we're making decent headway around that. Health and productivity, probably, again, more tricky at times. But again, like education, that's one where it's the moral support, it's the conversations, it's the richness of the discussion you can have, where you can pick stuff up and say, well, actually, this is what we're going to go for. But on a local level, and you know, Andrew, this is my 3rd time doing Centre for Cities, which I think must be some kind of like record. Or maybe it's because I talked about quinoa cafes not being in Stoke the first time I did it. And this morning I had falafel for my lunch because I could buy it.
Calm down. You are definitely becoming a suburb of Manchester.
I am, yeah.
If you get into that kind of stuff, I tell you what. Or even of London. I mean, who can say, right? I mean,
but I think, you know, we are doing reasonably well around some of these things, and I think, you know, we are making progress in terms of where we're going with all this moving forward. But I think, you know, got to keep pushing, and I think, as somebody else had already said, it can't be about beauty contests. It's got to be about the plan that you've got and what works for you as a place, and getting those conversations. Particularly, I think, you know, Andy said as well, it's not about towns versus cities. It never was. It's about what's right for your place, and how do you secure that conversation, and then the resource or moral support to get you over the line.
Very good. Thank you very much. Time again is against us, but Andy, just come back to you and then finish with you. I mean, you talked a little bit about it, but I mean, what needs to be in the white paper when we get it? We're promised it in early February is the latest I've heard. What needs to be in it for us to know it's serious? You know, because there can be lots in it, right? I mean, there's going to be loads in it. You know, but for those of us that really care about the success of our places, not just in the very short term or in the very cosmetic way, what would need to be in it for you to think this is government being serious about levelling up?
Real transfer of power and resources to all areas, to let all areas begin a sort of bottom-up journey of changing things in there. You know, there's everything that Abby was just saying. You know, back places to do what they need to do themselves, because they know their areas best. And I think, you know, it's real meaningful change for all parts of England. Everyone able to go on this journey at the speed that's right for them. Critically, I think Jules mentioned it and Abby mentioned it, skills. You know, why is that being hoarded? You know, why are we hoarding power over that in Whitehall? You know, the economies of all areas are different. And actually, when people come to me now and say, well, we're thinking of coming to Manchester, the thing they always ask is, can you give us guarantees over the talent pipeline? That's what they want to know about. And they just need to, you know, free us. I think Michael Gove gets this, to be honest with you, but it's whether government as a whole gets it, and particularly whether the DFE gets it. I think if you're going to build a new economy in these places, you've got to allow them to build a sort of people strategy to support it, a local skills strategy to support a local industrial strategy. So if there's not a big move on skills, I think that would be a big missed opportunity, Andrew, a big missed opportunity.
Yeah.
And conscious of your time, I'll finish on one last point, and I touched on it at the end of my opening remarks. They've got to bring ambition to it for the cities and the towns of our country. It's almost like levelling up a little bit. It's like, we'll give you this, you can have this bit off the table, because actually we don't really believe you can get much more. You know what I mean? It's almost, they're limiting our ambitions by this top-down approach, I think. And it's this thing that I was saying about HS2. You know, nobody in the north has called for the rail solution which they're trying to impose on us. Not one voice, Conservative or Labour, nobody. And yet this sort of downgraded plan is being sort of imposed on us, and they're almost limiting our ambitions, because they're not as ambitious for the north as we are. And I think that's what's got to change. You know, I think, as I said before, English, and I include Stoke, but I include everywhere, to be honest. You know, we'll all rise together, actually, if we get this right. It's not about, you know, one area having it all. And, you know, I must get those names off, Abby, for people. I must get those people back to Manchester who've been heading down there. But no, it's really good to hear what's happening in Stoke. They've got to be more ambitious. I think they're almost giving us half an ambition for our regions, and it shows in the sort of spending decisions that they're making. That, you know, well, we don't really believe you can you can be that good. So therefore, we'll go this far, but not further. You know, to do what they're doing at Piccadilly, Andrew. You know, that for me, if you built it right, would be the sort of Canary Wharf of the north, wouldn't it? It would be the heart of the north of England. You would have development around people. You have it anyway, and it would get even more. You would, you know, you're talking of the heartbeat of the north of England. Now, Leeds might say something different, but I believe that it would be the sort of, you know, the centre of the centre of the universe.
Very good
from our point of view.
Very good.
But they're giving us a station where all that land is taken away to build a station, because they're building it on the surface, and all of that land that could be the new economy of the north is being made into a kind of suboptimal surface station, because it's cheaper to do it that way than actually to build what is right to unlock the full potential of the north of England. And that's my final point.
Lovely.
Bring some ambition to this.
Ambition.
Be as ambitious about our places as we are. And don't give us this sort of like Whitehall thing, or you can't really be that good and you need to know your place, because you know, England's cities could be so much more than they currently are, and they just need to be backed.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you. Final 60 seconds from you, Jules. I mean, I know it's tough on that one, but you know,
I agree entirely with Andy about greater devolution, particularly in skills. Companies half companies out there are still returning their apprenticeship levy to the Treasury, so more devolution on that. I'm not sure how much the paper, any levelling up paper, is going to be relevant to London. They certainly haven't been giving us any money to address the issues in London. I think what we want to see on high streets, and what we've been talking about a lot today, is about curation and placemaking. I'm pleased that Michael Gove's ditched a lot of the planning reforms that were proposed before, but unfortunately we've still got permitted development rights, which really hampers good placemaking in the way that we need to use what we need to use on our high streets. Cities are definitely going to recover. I'm absolutely confident in that, but will they be built back better? And that speaks to what Andy said about our ambition. My final point will be about TfL. TfL, its deficit and its debt was coming down before COVID, the debt and deficit that we'd been left by the previous mayor. So contrary to all the puff that we've heard, those were reducing, but that's not going to happen with the lower ridership we have now. And if Transport for London declines, London's a less attractive place for people to locate from around the world. So these people aren't going to go to elsewhere in the UK, they're going to go abroad. So we need to restore that ability to attract international businesses. We're going to disincentivize tourists to come, and I've already covered how much we need tourists to come here, and also the access to economic opportunity for those people who can't otherwise afford to get around London. So all the things that we want to see restored back to London and make London thrive, a lot of that comes back to TfL, and London and the government has got to come up with a proper settlement for TfL.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Jules, a great point and a very significant point to end on. My huge thanks to Abby and to Andy and to Jules. Again, we could have carried on forever, but we need to move on. But thank you very much for your contributions. Okay. We now move to our third panel, as it were, panel of one. And our final speaker is Sebastian Payne. Sebastian is the Whitehall editor at the Financial Times and author of Broken Heartlands, A Journey Through Labour's Lost England. Sebastian, welcome.
Hi, Andy.
We're going to focus and give us a little bit of the politics, I suppose, of the high streets and levelling up agenda. But over to you, Sebastian. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, and apologies, my internet drops out. I'm speaking to you from Parliament here, which has questionable internet as well. So even in the heart of central London, this country's infrastructure is still a bit of a problem. I was very taken by the Centre for Cities report this year in terms of just how damaged the high streets have been due to the coronavirus pandemic. Because even before this, when I was going around the country in the 2019 election, you could see how many empty shops there were, how many town centres just lacked a general purpose after their main industries have gone, but also crucially people had moved out of those town centres. And one of the chapters in my book, which I revisited in 2020, was Blythe in Northumberland. And that's a place where everyone lived together, worked together and socialized together. And that gave the town centre its purpose. And it's been through several regenerations since the deindustrialization era. And so it doesn't really have a purpose. Is it an entertainment destination? Sort of, in a way. The former cinema has turned into a Wetherspoons. Again, not an uncommon thing you see. I mean, the shops have shrunk and closed down. And I think when you look at the scale of what COVID has done, it's really brought these questions to the fore here. And when you ask about the politics, Andy, what this is all about, of course, is the Levelling Up white paper, which has been delayed, I think, 3 times now, and it's due to come out early February. And this is going to set out the government's vision for how to deliver on what happened in the 2019 election. Now, that white paper is still being written at the moment. It's bouncing around Whitehall. And the key question here is going to be ambition. It's how much is the government going to go in there in terms of devolution, in terms of powers, and in terms of trying to drive through this change. Because in some respects, levelling up should be about hundreds, if not thousands, of tiny infrastructure projects happening to make incremental differences to the productivity gap across the country. The problem is seeing and delivering that is really tough. And as Andy Burnham was just saying there, when you're doing it from Whitehall in a very centralized way, that in itself is really problematic to do, because it means local communities don't necessarily have a say. And I think one of the biggest challenges of levelling up is going to be the strategic capacity for delivering this. So at the end of last year, I went up to Workington in Cumbria, and they've got about £23 million from one of the funds. I think it's the Towns Fund, and that the Allerdale Borough Council have actually got a really good plan for delivering that. But when your council only has a capital spend of £4 to £5 million a year, getting £23 million is a big ask. And the question is, how is this money going to be spent? How is it going to be delivered? And how is it going to be well monitored? Now, in those parts of the country that have a directly elected mayor and a clear conurbation and have the capacity through their combined authority, that's fine. And I think you've seen that with Ben Houchin in Tees Valley, as well as Andy Street in the West Midlands. But I think the problem is a lot of these smaller towns don't have a mayoralty, and their local governments have been completely routed over the past decade of cuts to local government funding. And I do worry about how that money is going to get there and be spent effectively. And that's one of the big questions for me in this levelling up white paper. And obviously there's a huge amount of political turmoil in Westminster at the moment, which may further delay that white paper. But of course, the Johnson government just doesn't have much time left to try and do this stuff. It's only got 2 years or so until the next election is due, and actually getting stuff done and getting it delivered, there's not much time to get shovels in the ground. And I think by the time you get to the end of 2023, when the next election cycle will start, I'm not convinced that much stuff is going to be done. I think a lot of things will be in train, but not a lot of changes on the ground. So I think that's the overview of where levelling up is. Obviously, the whole thing has been made so much harder by the coronavirus pandemic, not just in terms of money, that obviously we've spent, £400 billion of public funds have gone on the pandemic recovery, but also that structural change you've highlighted in your excellent research on the high street, but also just central government capacity as well, that every part of the public realm has been affected by the pandemic and has got some kind of gap or backlog in what needs to be done here. So whether it's courts, NHS, local government, education, skills, you name it, it's all been bunged up by coronavirus. And that in itself has made the job of levelling up even harder.
Thank you very much. So, I mean, do you, you talked about that. Do you think the requirement to show something on the ground, i.e. in the next 2 years, is the sort of primary driving force at the now where we are in terms of levelling up, which may be, if they'd started it in 2019, maybe the emphasis would have been different, but just being able to point to something in 2 years' time or whenever it might be, do you think that is the real driving force now behind the white paper?
I think obviously when this paper comes out, I think it's probably going to take a sort of almost decade-long vision. And when I interviewed Boris Johnson for Broken Heartland, he talked about this idea that to truly level up the UK and to close that regional inequality gap, it's a decade-long thing. And most economic transformations tend to take that period of time. Obviously, the government has its eye on the next election and wants to, because the message that if Boris Johnson makes it the next election or whoever replaces him is still going to be the same, is we've made some progress, we've got out the pandemic, but we will build the progress we've made in terms of hospitals or skills or education or local government. So they are looking at the immediate terms in terms of, their political future. But I also think there will be a long-term element to it as well.
Okay, that's very good. And a final question, I suppose, somebody from you is, will Levelling Up survive? Could it survive a change in Prime Minister?
It's a very good question, because the term is a very Boris Johnson term. It's one that he came up with on the steps of Downing Street after the 2019 election. What it was about was saying all these millions of people who voted Conservative for the first time, those scores of seats that have returned Conservative MPs for the first time, we're going to repay your trust. We are not going to just do things as normal. And I think that was probably right, because the thing that I found in my book is those people wanted change. They felt the political and economic system was not delivering for them. They'd had decades of underinvestment in their public services and was suffering from a lack of private sector investment too. So that architecture, I think, was probably right. And I think most Labour politicians have bought into that too. If you look at Lisa Nandy, who's the shadow Levelling Up secretary, she is very much behind the programme, the ideas of it. Now, if Boris Johnson doesn't survive the political turmoil of the next couple of weeks, then whoever replaces him, I think, still has to do Levelling Up, because the Tory coalition now has pivoted much more to these places. It's much more the Brexit vote, it's the smaller towns, it's the much more less diverse place they were winning under David Cameron. And so if we were to have a Tory leadership contest, I think that would be a key plan for all of them. If Michael Gove was to run, for example, he would say, look, I am the guy to get Levelling Up done. Rishi Sunak, for example, would say, I'm the Chancellor representing a northern constituency who's brought the treasure to the north. I get the importance of levelling up, and on it would go in that sense. So the question, though, is the disruption we're going to have with the leadership contest, but also the cost of living crisis, inflation, the situation in Ukraine. There's so much pressure on the British state now that, to me, and as I've argued in the book, to level up successfully, it is the same challenge the British state as Brexit. You've got to have a real drive, top-class ministers and officials being willing to devolve the power, have clear plans on how you deliver it. And at the moment, they're getting there, but it's still very slow and very gradual. And I think there is a clear intent, if not the actual focus on doing it. So that is the challenge ahead. And really, just time is running out. And I think the more interesting question is, if the Tories don't win the next election, does Labour take up the Levelling Up agenda? Because Labour's only going to win by winning back those places that went Tory in 2019. So does Keir Starmer and Lisa Nandy say, look, we're going to do Levelling Up, but we're going to do it in a Labour way, which means that really no matter who wins, the agenda could still survive.
Fantastic. That's a really good and interesting thought to finish on. Maybe we'll come back to that in future sessions around, what the Labour position should or could be, and what the political gains might be if they take it seriously. Sebastian, thank you very much for spending a bit of time with us. Look, we could go on, but we unfortunately can't. It's very close to 1:30, and I said we would finish by then. So let me, a huge thanks to all my panelists today. We've had many: Caroline, Tony, Tom, Abby, Andy, Jules, and Sebastian. Thank you all for spending some time with us and sharing your thoughts on what's going on in your patch and from your perspective. Thank you all for joining, posting your questions. Tried to pick up some of them, but never get to anywhere near all of them. But thank you very much for doing it. As I said, you can read Cities Outlook in all its glory and all its detail on our website, centreforcities.org. You can also find loads of related material, videos, blogs, podcasts, everything to whet your appetite and give you all the detail that you desire. And in addition to looking at Outlook, you can explore and compare the latest economic data on all of our cities and towns that we look at, 63 biggest in the UK, and look at more than 30 indicators there to see what's going on. So hopefully that'll give you something to do for the rest of the day. But until the next time, take care.